Just a little bit about myself. I own a small consulting firm in Ankeny, Iowa, Hazardous Materials Consulting, and I've been doing work with schools for about the last 25 years, trying to help educate and answer questions about everything from risk minimization and safe chemical management to waste disposal and ongoing operations. So I also did a stint as a volunteer firefighter for a few years. So I'm very in tune and work with the local hazardous materials response team and the local fire department. So I've done a lot of emergency response work, and I think it gives me just kind of a unique perspective to be able to help teach schools the best ways to minimize risk when it comes to chemicals. And I'm not talking, today we're going to focus on science lab chemicals, and for a number of our webinars we're focused on science, but we also do have some webinars that will be addressing things like chemicals that are in art classrooms, industrial technology facilities, those types of areas as well. Just real quick, I want to say a thank you to Region 1. EPA Region 1 is the funding source for these webinars, and we very much appreciate that. Also a thank you to Dave Waddell. He's my mentor, and he has presented schools across the nation with excellent education and risk management. I've worked with him on and off, and a lot of the materials that you'll see have come from Dave Waddell. And then finally to Vicki Davis of the I can never remember this, Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Regional Planning Commission. Vicki is the person that has spearheaded applying for grant monies to get these things done, and she's been absolutely fantastic to work with. And so I really appreciate all of you in helping us get some answers and get some good guidance up to schools. So the goals for these webinars are to make sure that you understand as school employees what regulatory rules and requirements you are under, some strategies for identifying what things to keep in your chemical stock rooms and what are probably too risky to have on site. And then also to help just with ongoing options for hazardous waste disposal, universal waste disposal. We really want to encourage you to think about all of the different experiments and demonstrations that you're doing to make sure that they're the safest as possible for the schools. So a couple of little pointers for today's webinar. If you do have questions, please enter them into the question and answer box. The chat is shut down right now as far as participants being able to list anything in it. But if I do have any references or anything, I'll try to remember to put that information in the chat so that you can grab onto that information. Closed captioning is available if that will help you out. And then there's some audio and sound troubleshooting, a little tip that says, you know, this is what you need to select down at the bottom. So if you have any troubles with that, please reach out and we'll do what we can to see if we can help you. So there are the tips for the Zoom strategies for today. So if you've got anything, any questions that you have, please make sure that you put them in the question and answer. And then we'll try to answer all of those at the end. I'll get through them as much as I possibly can. You're also welcome. My email information and phone number will be on the last slide, and you're absolutely welcome to reach out to me or to Vicki Davis, and we will offer you as much guidance as possible in working through to make sure that your school is as safe and meeting regulatory compliance requirements as much as possible. Okay. All right. There we go. Vicki, let me know if I screw anything up and push a wrong button. Okay. And things disappear. I'll try really hard not to do that. So topics for today. So over the last couple of webinars, what we've talked about are how do you identify if your district has legacy chemicals? And then also, if you do have legacy chemicals, are there ones that are present that are very, very dangerous? We've hopefully given you some good guidance and tools to identify those. And remember, with those dangerous legacy chemicals that we identified in the first webinar, we want to make sure that we leave those in place. We don't move them around. We work with our colleagues so that they understand that they're present in our stock rooms. And then we alert our administration and we start coming up with a plan. If you find any of those and you need some assistance in developing a disposal plan for those, please reach out and we will work with you to coordinate with local emergency response or hazardous waste cleanup crews to see if we can get those taken care of. That's one of the predominant things that I want to make sure is that everybody is being very, very safe as they're looking through their stock rooms and evaluating legacy chemicals. We talked about making sure that you have safety measures in place in your classroom and that you've also implemented personal protective equipment. And so I just kind of want to reiterate that. I am working on still getting those last 2 webinars posted to my website. I'm a little slow on that and I apologize profusely, but know that in the next few weeks, they will be available to you. You'll be able to watch them again or forward them to anybody else to watch. So I'm asking for a little patience on that. As we've gone through and assessed whether or not we have legacy chemicals, the next step that I asked you to do was to look at the chemicals that you use in your experiments and identify an inventory of chemicals that you want to keep. We want to then look at those containers and make sure that they meet the 4 criteria that we talked about last time, that the chemicals aren't too old, they're not in compromised containers, they're not in excess quantities, and that they're also not too risky to be used with the age groups that you're working with. So those were the 4 criteria that we laid out during the last webinar. And I hope that you've all had an opportunity to go through and inventory those chemicals that you use, and then begin identifying whether or not they're in good enough shape for you to keep. There are times that we have folks that will do that inventory and they'll come across a lot of legacy chemicals that they've been using. And in those situations, we actually want to work with our facilities people and we want to work with our administrators to replace those. Anytime you're going to do a demonstration or have your students work with any chemicals, we want to make sure that those chemicals are going to behave the way that we anticipate and that they should behave. The last thing we want you to do is be working with old chemicals that misbehave or don't present themselves, don't react the way that we anticipate when we're doing our experiments. So we want to focus on that a little bit. We've minimized risk already just by identifying those legacy chemicals and by identifying those chemicals that maybe need to be disposed of. So today's topic is tough, okay? And I just want to preface today's webinar with a couple of little disclaimers. Okay, first of all, this is 2024. I think we're still, March of 2024. So if you're watching this webinar in 2052, please know that the information is applicable to today, and the regulatory citations that I'm going to provide to you today and the regulatory information is pertinent and accurate to today. It may have changed. So I would encourage you, before you dive into any regulations and you're not watching this today, you're not watching it live, to make sure that you're checking with your local regulators that you're following the regulations that are current. Regulations are tough things. And hazardous waste and waste in general presents us with a lot of regulatory nuances, a lot of detail that we have to pay attention to. I am unfortunately not going to be able in 1 hour to cover all of those nuances and rules. I'm going to educate you and focus on the high level, the big picture of where these regulations are located, who regulates you, and where you can find that information. All right, so please know that you're not going to end, this 1 hour presentation being a hazardous waste expert. I've been doing this for 30 years now, and I learn new details with hazardous waste management regularly. So particularly when it comes to differences from state to state. We'll provide you with questions and answers at the end of today's session as much as possible. So please make sure that if you have questions, that last 30 minutes is dedicated to helping you understand all of the different rules and regulations. Okay, final housekeeping. So I just talked with you about the question and answers, and then that whole giant 3-paragraph stuff on there is the disclaimer that says, hey, I'm going to give you the most pertinent current information that I have right now. And the strategies that I'm going to educate you about are strategies that are in compliance right now. They may have changed. So if you're watching this again at a later date, please make sure you work with your local regulators to make sure that you're handling things correctly. So, all right, with that, let's go ahead and I'm going to turn off the camera and then we're going to go ahead and Vicki, can you still see the presentation there?
Looks good.
Okay, excellent. All right, so I'm going to go through just quickly where we're at right now in this process. And what we've done in the last couple webinars is we've recognized and assessed whether or not we have those legacy chemicals. We've identified where the highest risk ones are. Hopefully you've identified and drawn out a map, just a simple map of your classroom, and you've inspected your lab safety equipment to make sure that it's working. That's one of the things that if you do find things that are not working in your lab safety equipment, let's say your safety shower hasn't been flushed in who knows how long and it's got cobwebs and rust in it, you're going to want to work with your facilities person to get that done. So before we start tackling anything like reorganization of the stock room, we want to make sure that you're going to be safe. We've also gone through in the last webinar a list of personal protective equipment that you should have. Safety glasses or goggles, gloves, lab aprons, closed-toed shoes, bunch of different personal protective equipment that you need to have in place. One of the things that I also added in last time was the recommendation for you to get what's called an intrinsically safe flashlight. And I will put that in the chat at the end so that you have an idea what you're looking for. But what we want to do is we want to make sure that if we need a flashlight to look in the deep back depths of those storage shelves, that we're not introducing a sparking area, a sparking mechanism to that. So we want to use an intrinsically safe flashlight. Want to make sure that you work with your, once you've been working with your team for a while, the next step that we want you to do is to develop a disposal plan for anything that is a high hazard legacy chemical, anything that's outdated, has a container that's compromised, or that you have a super large quantity of. Last webinar, we took you through a process where we looked at what constituted excess chemicals. And it's basically anytime you have more than about a 5-year supply, that's when we want to minimize that amount of chemical on site. And then finally, the risk exceeds utility. So those are all parts of the chemical hygiene plan. And the next thing that we're going to talk through is what to do and what we have for disposal options. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today as we're going through the regulations and those things that apply to you. Okay. First tough topic is what are the rules and who oversees our regulations? So who are we regulated by? And a lot of folks think that these regulations that we're going to be talking about fall mostly under OSHA. OSHA has what's called the General Duty Clause, which basically states that your employer is required to provide you with a safe workplace and to protect workers. Schools, however, are not businesses. So this gets a little muddy here and there. We also have some schools where teachers are not covered by OSHA. In New Hampshire, they are not. In Vermont, they are. In Iowa, they are. So it gets a little crazy for us. If you are covered by OSHA, if you are in a state OSHA program, then you are subject to what's called the laboratory standard. And the laboratory standard is located in 29 CFR, which is the Code of Federal Regulations. If you go out to Google and you type in that 29 CFR 1910.1450, that's where the laboratory standard is. Part of the laboratory standard says that you have to have a written chemical hygiene plan. You also have to have an identified chemical safety officer, an inventory of chemicals, safety data sheets. There are a lot of components for that. One of the things that's coming up on one of our webinars is how to write a chemical hygiene plan. And I'll present you with some templates for that and then some high points. But again, we've talked about already, if you've built your inventory and now you're working on a disposal plan, You've got a map of your safety equipment, and you've got your personal protective equipment identified. Those are all components of that chemical hygiene plan. I get a lot of questions from teachers and also from administrators about, well, does the fire code apply? And the challenge with IFC, or the International Fire Code, or NFPA, which is the National Fire Protection Association, both of those agencies, they govern predominantly businesses that are in the manufacture of hazardous chemicals. What we find with fire code is that frequently the quantities that we find in lab stock rooms do not exceed or violate those codes. So while schools do fall under IFC or NFPA, depending on which of the agencies is governing in your state, it doesn't necessarily impact or address the challenges that we see in overcrowded stock rooms. Again, they're targeted predominantly at manufacturing. So we don't necessarily fall under a lot of those IFC or NFPA limitations. We also find frequently that we don't fall under, we will occasionally in school stock rooms find DEA regulated materials, controlled substances that when schools obtained them were not controlled substances, or they were even prior to when the DEA began to exist. They're that old. So DEA does regulate some of those things, but not enough to come in and inspect. Department of Public Health regulates radioactives typically, but again, not enough for them to come in and inspect. And then Department of Education, we've seen in almost all states, frequently has a pretty hands-off approach to chemical safety, chemical management. The predominant regulatory authority that these regulations and rules that we're going to be going through come from are EPA and state environmental regulators. And the way that this section of code works is that EPA developed this section of code based on Congress's requirements. EPA refined the specific statutes, and then most states chose to implement their own environmental regulations, and they adopted EPA federal regulations and then customized them to the states. And as they customized those, they had to be as restrictive as the federal regulations or more restrictive than federal regulations. And what we found is that we have a number of states that have just slight differences, but there's significant and substantial differences in how you manage hazardous and universal waste, or various different waste types. Historically, if we mess this up, this is the regulating body, EPA or the state environmental regulators, that will issue penalties and financial repercussions for violations. So those are the folks, and those are the primary regulations that we're gonna focus on today, making sure that we keep those regulations, that we follow them and that we're in compliance with them. Now, waste disposal is tough, okay? And again, I said that earlier today, but I really want to emphasize to you, it's complicated and it can be very expensive if you don't follow it down to the T, okay? And I'm talking about very substantial attention to the details of these regulations. The penalties can be very costly. So we absolutely want to make sure that you're doing these things right. These regulations are designed to protect people, you, students, the rest of your community, and they're also designed to protect the environment and to conserve resources. So those are the things that they're focused on. There are a lot of rules in waste disposal that make compliance particularly challenging for schools. And we're going to talk about a couple of those types of those nuances today. But again, we're not going to be able to cover all of them. I just can't make you a regulatory expert in an hour, but I want to raise your awareness, make sure that you know where to look so that you can find correct answers, and make sure that you have resources available to you. So I will be posting additional resources on my website. And again, you'll have my email and you have Vicky's email So if there's anything that you have that you need some additional clarity on, please feel free to reach out. So just a brief history, all of these regulations can be found in what's called the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And what you'll hear this referred to as RCRA. Okay, so if you're working with any of your hazardous waste disposal teams or you call a regulator, what you're going to want to say is I'm trying to understand RCRA regulations at the federal level. These were started in 1976. And so we can't use that excuse of, well, shoot, I didn't even know that this was a thing. They've been around long enough that if you are generating waste, if you are creating waste, that you need to understand that all of the solid waste, hazardous waste, universal waste regulations are governed by either EPA at the federal level or by your state's environmental agency at the state level. One of the things that is challenging for school districts is that these regulations are applied by the facility. So a science room is not just a generator. An art classroom is not just a generator. A bus barn is not. These environmental regulations are governed at the facility physical address location. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. The categories of waste that's regulated, and if you would have told me 25 years ago, 30 years ago, that waste was this complicated, I would have rolled my eyes at you and said, no way, it's just trash. Unfortunately, that is just not the way it is. There are several different types of regulated waste. This is just a preliminary portion of them. But these are the primary ones that are impacting schools. And all of these regulations can be found in Chapter 40 of the Code of Federal Regulations. So if you type in RCRA, RCRA, or Chapter 40 CFR, these regulations will be available to you and you can start reading them. I will tell you that reading the regulations is not a fun adventure. It's very difficult, it's confusing, and it takes quite a bit of time. So, but I'm going to do the best that I can today to explain this to you, explain these things to you at a very high level, and make sure that you at least have some resources and some understanding of what you need to do. So the first thing that we want to talk about is RCRA is called a cradle to grave regulation. And what that means is that when you generate or create waste, solid waste, hazardous waste, universal waste, any of those wastes, you are responsible for that waste from the time that you create it to the time that it goes to the grave, or that it ends up being either disposed in a landfill, destroyed in an incinerator, all of those things, all of those end destination facilities, you are responsible for that. So you want to make sure that throughout that process, that all of those steps along the way, the landfill that you're using, the hazardous waste treatment storage disposal facility that you're using, that those are good, solid, well managed, and potentially permitted. In fact, they would all be permitted, end of life facilities. Okay. That's one of the mistakes that I've seen made over the years, is that frequently I've seen school districts that have been required to accept low bid on disposal of certain types of waste. And what we find out is the waste is never actually disposed. It's just moved from the school district to someplace else where it's stockpiled. And then it becomes a very large, very expensive cleanup. So anytime that you're selecting vendors to work with for any type of waste disposal, you want to make sure that wherever they're going with your waste is a permitted legal facility. Okay. When you create waste, and EPA actually divides this down and summarizes this even more tightly and says, when you create hazardous waste, you are what's called a generator. Now, for the purposes of this, because we're working at a pretty high level today, and I'm trying to teach you the language generalities of working with waste, I'm going to say anytime you create a waste of any kind, I want you to think in your head, okay, I just generated waste. The regulations are based predominantly on hazardous waste, so that's what we're going to focus on. But know that EPA also regulates things like solid waste. So your trash in your landfill facilities, waste to energy incinerators, any of those types of facilities are also all regulated by EPA. The EPA regulations are based on how much waste is generated per address, and that's a physical address. Different states have different rules for how waste is handled. The one thing that all these rules have in common, though, is the more hazardous waste you generate in a calendar month, the more regulatory requirements you fall under. So if, for example, we have a school district that has, let's say there's legacy chemicals in the stock room, and there's abandoned chemicals in the art room, and the facilities room has a bunch of old cleaning products that they aren't using any longer. If we all of a sudden decide to do a clean out of all of those areas in one calendar month, we're going to be regulated. It's highly likely that we will fall under the highest level of regulation. So one of the things that we want to do is we want to think about that process, and we want to work with our local regulators to see if we can come up with a process that really reflects how much waste you're actually generating in a calendar month. Julie has put up in the question and answer section a link to the New Hampshire regulations, and this is outstanding information. Thank you, Julie. I appreciate that. New Hampshire has actually, both New Hampshire and Vermont do an exceptional job of educating and reaching out to individuals with guidance documents. So if you have any questions about your regulations, specifically where you're at, please make sure you're looking them up and asking for some help. One of the other challenging things with hazardous waste is that waste is coded and it's tracked by generator. To manage these amounts of hazardous waste that are generated every calendar month can be very challenging. So we want to understand what that means for schools. We're not going to be able, again, to cover all the details, but I'm going to really try hard to give you the biggest high points here. Okay, so step one of this that we're going to talk about, I'm going to go back to the last slide. So we're going to go through these 6 steps, and we're going to break each one of them down, and I'll give you more details about them. So let's start with step number 1. When you create a waste, you're a generator. When you create a hazardous waste, the EPA term that is cited in the code is generators. So you want to understand that you become a generator. Now, this is not a generator by your classroom, but it's, again, this generator is by facility or by physical address. One of the questions that we have to go through is to determine, okay, is this something really, is what we're trying to get rid of, is it really a waste? Is it recyclable? Is it reusable by somebody else? And so one of the things that EPA starts with typically is an evaluation to see, is this a waste? So we want to go through these questions. And the first thing that we're going to look at, oh, yep, I apologize. We can't see you guys can't see the question and answer. I will make sure that I post those out on the chat at the end of the session today, okay? All right, so the first thing what we want to answer is what is a waste? A waste is an item that either you don't want it, so something that's like a dangerous legacy chemical, something that is far too dangerous to have in the classroom, or it's degraded to the point that it's unstable. Second thing is you can't use it. The risk exceeds the utility. One of those things I would suggest to you would be mercury thermometers. Mercury thermometers are exceptionally accurate in most of the commercial labs and industrial labs that I work with. They usually keep 1 or 2 mercury thermometers, but I'm going to suggest that in school districts, mercury thermometers far exceed the benefit, because when we drop and break a mercury thermometer, the cost to clean that up to where it meets the exposure standards is ridiculously low and ridiculously expensive. So even though our mercury thermometers are, we see those in schools, I'm going to encourage you to add those to your disposal list and go with the other, the alcohol thermometers. The next class is an unknown. So is an unknown a waste? So for example, if you've got a whole shelf of solutions, and folks, I'm getting a lot of questions about what the links are. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in the chat right now. Okay. There's the link to the Hazardous Waste Coordinator certification for New Hampshire. There are also several links. New Hampshire also has a number of videos present on their website. Okay. So, all right, let's get back to the presentation then. All right, so the wastes the questions that we want to ask. So if a waste is something that we don't want in our stockroom, it's dangerous. We can't use it because the risk exceeds the utility. We don't know what it is. For example, solutions that are left over from teachers long ago. It's orphaned or abandoned. And this would be something, and this is something that can apply to the entire facility. But things like really, really old computer monitors that have cathode ray tubes in them or have high levels of lead in their glass. Those would be orphaned or abandoned. And then spills. So for example, if we have a really bad day and we drop a 4-liter bottle of acetone, that spill material would also be considered a waste. So those are the different types of waste. If you come across any of these and you ask these questions and the answer is, yep, I want to get rid of it, then it becomes a waste and you are now a generator. Now the next step is, how is that regulated? And it's regulated by address. So it's not class, not department, it's regulated by address. The school campuses have multiple buildings on them, but they don't have any DOT roadways through them. And I'm going to show you some examples in the next slide. But if you have a large campus, and let's say you've got a bus barn, an elementary school, and a high school all on the same campus, and you don't have a road through it, that's considered a contiguous campus by EPA. And that is regulated as one facility. So if I have chemical waste from my science room, I have art waste, I maybe have some facilities waste from the elementary building, I have bus barn waste, all of those waste streams together are generated by that facility. It can be very confusing and very complex. The thing you need to remember though is that we really need to identify one person as the primary contact for the entire facility. We want to make one person the contact for the entire facility. And that person needs to understand hazardous waste regulations. Also, all of the folks that are bringing that person hazardous waste, typically I find that this ends up being the facilities manager. And what ends up happening is that throughout the year, stuff just shows up in facilities. And all of a sudden we have the facilities manager going, I don't know where all this stuff came from. I don't know what all it is. Just know that all of that together, if it comes in one calendar month, it means that you're adding up and you could be above the thresholds where you're regulated more heavily. So we have to be very cautious about this. And if it's possible to only clean out certain areas in certain calendar months, it might help you with a strategy to minimize the amount of regulations you fall under. So we want to make sure that first of all, that everybody that is generating hazardous waste knows who that key contact is, and that they're working with that key contact throughout that contiguous site to manage things safely, properly, and to have some clear communication as to what those things are. Okay, some examples listed here. So In the upper left corner, we have one campus. It's a large campus. It's got multiple buildings on it, and there is no DOT road through it. That would be considered one hazardous waste generator site. On the upper right, we have a campus map. This is like a university or community college map. Sometimes we see districts that have large school districts, in fact, that will have DOT roads through the campuses. If you have DOT roads that divide up the campus, then you have multiple generator sites on campus, if each of those sites is generating hazardous waste. And then down in the center middle, that photo is a school with a bus barn associated with it. Again, we have no DOT road. So we have one generator site there for hazardous waste. Okay. And I know this gets confusing. So again, if you have any questions, stick them in the Q&A and we'll try to cover them at the end. If it's very, very, very muddy for you and you're in the middle, if you're up to your eyeballs in this, please don't hesitate to reach out to Vicki or I, and we will make sure that you have the proper guidance for your state. Next question, or next step, is that different states have different rules for waste. These are just some of the state requirements. These are not all inclusive, okay? Please know I'm just hitting the high points here. And I want to make sure that you know that you need to reach out to your individual state, because there are some nuances and some details associated with some of the state regulations that are really critical for you to get right. In New Hampshire, for example, at the federal level, we have 3 different classifications of hazardous waste generators, what are called very small quantity generators, small quantity generators, and large quantity generators. In New Hampshire, the state agency has changed that to 2 different generator classifications. FQGs, which are full quantity generators, and LQGs, large quantity generators. I'm sorry, FQGs, full quantity generators, and SQGs, small quantity generators. So as you can see, it can get very, very confusing very quickly. So please make sure if you're in New Hampshire and you're going through a disposal, that you reach out and ask for some guidance. Make sure that you're also part of their, one of the things that New Hampshire also requires is hazardous waste coordinator certification, and they offer a class for anybody that needs that. So I'm going to encourage you to take a look at that and make sure that you're in compliance with those regulations. In Vermont, Vermont sticks with the 3 generator categories that EPA uses, which is very small quantity generator, small quantity, and large quantity generators. But in Vermont, we see several unique state waste codes. And so that's a specialty nuance in Vermont that we've got to pay attention to. In Iowa, things are a little more simplified. We are the only state in the contiguous US that is regulated by federal EPA and does not have its own state regulated program. So everything that we do in Iowa follows the federal regulations. All right. Step 4 is the more hazardous waste that is generated, the more regulations you fall under. So remember, other than New Hampshire, we have 3 generator statuses. If you're generating less than 220 pounds in a calendar month, you're a very small quantity generator and you fall under the least restrictive hazardous waste regulations. The way that I explain it to industry, and this is just a high level example, is if you can maintain VSQG status, you have about 15 rules to follow. If you move up to small quantity generator, you got about 50. You move up to large quantity generator, it's likely you're over 75 or 100, depending on the state that you're in. So those are just generalized numbers. Please don't hold me to those, but it just gives you an example of why it's to your benefit, if at all possible, to minimize the amount of hazardous waste that you generate in a calendar month. The codes that are assigned to those hazardous waste can be very tricky. We're going to go through those on the next slide. You also want to make sure that, again, you have a knowledgeable professional that's helping you out with these. And one of the other things that I really wanted to emphasize too, and a lot of folks don't know this, but there is paperwork documentation that's required when you are shipping hazardous waste. It's called a hazardous waste manifest or a universal hazardous waste manifest. That's actually a requirement of the law for both EPA and DOT. And one of the things a lot of schools don't know is if you sign that document, you are certifying that you have had general awareness training for DOT. Okay, and that is a requirement of the law as well. A lot of teachers and a lot of facilities personnel do not know that. When they sign that, when they sign a manifest, if they have not had that DOT training, they're actually in violation. So we want to make sure DOT training is available. There's several locations online that DOT is training. If you have training is available. If you have questions about that, let me know. Okay, step 5, we're getting it really into the weeds here. And what we're talking about now is how waste is coded and how long you can let waste sit around. One of the factors that's associated with what's called your generator status, whether you're a very small quantity generator, a small quantity generator, or a large quantity generator, one of the regulations says that you have to get rid of your hazardous waste within a certain amount of time. Now for VSQGs, that's pretty muddy. Usually we say 12 months, but it's actually, there's some more flexibility in that. For small and large quantity generators, there's a finite timeline though, from the time that you generate or decide that something is a hazardous waste to the time that you dispose of it. For large quantity generators or full quantity generators, that timeline is 90 days. So it is not very long. For small quantity generators, that timeline goes to 180 days. Still not very much time. And one of the things that as the generator that you do, once you decide you want to get rid of something, is that you have to do what's called a waste determination. Is the waste hazardous? Is it recyclable? And we start with a number of these questions. There are also guidance, there's a lot of guidance out there on EPA's website as well that takes you through kind of a question and answer flow chart for how to make a waste determination. We're going to talk about this at a really high level again in the next few slides. First thing is we have to decide if the waste is hazardous. And the criteria that we use are what are called in different waste, are sections or categories called waste codes. So each of these categories captures different types of hazardous waste. And we assign codes to them. For example, F-listed waste would be waste that comes out of parts washer solution. It's a blend of flammable or ignitable solvents. And F-listed waste is typically, it starts when we code it on a manifest, we put the letter F first, and then we put 001, 002, 003, depending on what the code is that EPA assigns to it. I will put the citation. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and put the citation up right now. So when we're looking at codes, we're going to look at 40 CFR section 260. Okay. So that's what you want to put into Google, and that will help you find where the listed wastes are. You're going to look at the F list. The K list is mostly industrial waste streams, so it's highly doubtful that you would have any K listed waste. And then I'm going to skip over the D list for just a second. And we're going to talk about the U list and the P list, because these are most predominantly found in stock rooms when we do a stockroom clean out or a legacy chemical disposal. And what these are frequently are unused lab chemicals or commercial chemical products. And they are, the way that I learned it was that they are unused and pure. That's how you remember they're U-coded or P-coded. Pure and unused. What that means is that they're one component They're commercial, chemical, or unused lab products, and they appear on the lists that are in 40 CFR 260. Okay. Now we're going to go through some specific examples here in the next slide. So F-listed solvents, and how does this pertain to school districts? If I'm dealing with solvents in my, let's say I'm teaching an organic science lab, and I've got one experiment that uses toluene, one that uses xylene, one that uses these other solvents, I can collect all of those compatible ignitable solvents together, and I can dispose of them through a hazardous waste treatment and storage and disposal facility, but I have to put an F code on them, depending on what solvents are in the blend and what concentration. The U, excuse me, the U list is also found in 40 CFR 260, and it lists for me things like acetone, ethyl acetate, acetonitrile. There are a couple of hundred lab chemicals that are listed in the U list. And if I have a container of anything there that is old and outdated and I don't want it, I would use the U code then to describe that on my manifest. According to DOT regulations, if I have several U listed chemicals that are compatible with each other, I can pack all of those together in one container and dispose of them, as long as I list out all of those independent U list codes. The P list, oh, my apologies. The P list are those chemicals that have been determined to be acutely toxic. If you have any chemicals that are on the P list, I would really encourage you to add those to your disposal list. Those are not chemicals that the risk of having those chemicals around typically far exceeds the utilities of the chemicals. So please strongly consider, if you have any P listeds, to get rid of those. The next section that we're going to talk about are all of the delisted wastes, and delisted wastes are what are called characteristic wastes. And what that simply means is we do an experiment, we end up with waste at the end, we look at it and we determine, hey, does that waste, all of the waste that we've contained at the end, does that meet any of these criteria? Is it ignitable with a flash point of less than 40? Is it corrosive with a pH of less than or greater than, or less than or equal to 2, or greater than or equal to 12.5? Is it reactive? Is it toxic? And there is on the D list, in the same section of code, 40 CFR 261, there are specific limits on toxicity. You can work those through calculations to determine what your concentration is. Or you can also do what's called a TCLP test, a toxic leachate characteristic profile test. It's a very unique test that a hazardous waste company can coach you on if you have a combined waste stream. Okay. I know all of this is I'm really into the muck here. I'm really into the weeds. And I know I'm hitting this at a very high level, and I apologize for that. But again, this is how complex it is. And that's really the message that I want you to take away today. I don't expect you to understand all of this stuff. It is very detailed. What I want you to take away from this is waste is hard. Hazardous waste is really, really difficult to get right and to comply with. And so you need some professional support and assistance, either from a qualified hazardous waste company or from your local state regulators. Ask for some guidance, and they will help you work through how to dispose of these things. So we talked about F list, U list, and P list. We talked about characteristic waste. Examples of characteristic waste. So for example, if you do an extraction and you've got a little acetone, you've got another experiment you do with methanol left over, those can be combined, but those will all be considered characteristic ignitable waste. And the code for that is D001. If you have acids I would not advise you to mix any acid waste together. I would encourage you to keep those individual and separated just from a compatibility perspective and a reactivity perspective. But then you have corrosive waste. There's some examples of reactive waste. And then for toxic waste, it's things like, predominantly in schools, we see things like, I want to get rid of some old 2,4-D in facilities. I want to get rid of some old pesticides in facilities. I've got some toxic solvents such as methyl ketone, or we've got chemicals that have hazardous metals in them. So these are some of the key points, and this just kind of waters it down for you. Again, we really got into the weeds on those D codes, F codes, and the other listed waste codes. Those are the areas that you need to ask for some assistance on. If it's hazardous, if you figure out that some chemical that you've generated is hazardous, you have to dispose of it according to regulatory requirements. If you do not, then that's where we get ourselves into trouble with penalties. If we have a chemical waste that is on either the U list, the P list, the F list, or the D list, it's highly likely that you're going to fall under a lot of regulations. You're going to want some help with that. All buildings and departments on a contiguous campus need to work together for this. And one of the things that we run into is that if we can focus on different areas of this school, not everybody bringing out their waste for disposal in May or June, and then again in August, if we can parse those over throughout the year, there's a possibility we can minimize our regulatory burden. But again, that requires a lot of coordination and work with your hazardous waste disposal company. If a school has a lot of legacy chemicals to dispose of, there is a mechanism under federal EPA called episodic generation, where you can just do one fell swoop and get rid of all of them at one time. And it's complicated to get that right. And so I'm going to encourage you to, again, work with your hazardous waste disposal company if you have a lot of hazardous legacy chemicals. Other regulated wastes that we see that are regulated and found frequently in schools are things like what we call universal waste. This is an EPA term. And basically it's hazardous waste that a lot of different entities have. And because a lot of different entities have it, and everybody likely would move into that large quantity or full quantity generator status, these are things that we handle a little differently. A lot of times we can recycle components from them. And they're things like batteries, lamps or fluorescent light bulbs, mercury containing devices, and most recently, federal EPA added in aerosol cans. New Hampshire has things a little bit differently, so does Vermont. So again, we want to make absolutely certain that we can see or that we work with our state regulators to identify what are the different regulated wastes. Used oil is another one that we see all over the place in school districts that's heavily regulated. So is used antifreeze. Pharmaceuticals, such as from a nurse's office at the end of the year, also might be regulated. So again, look at your state regulations on that. Strategies for you to minimize some of those expenses because hazardous waste disposal is very expensive. There are some things that we find in chemical stockrooms that can be disposed of just by throwing them in the standard trash. These are things that are not hazardous. They're not listed, they're not characteristic, and they're not going to present any risk to us or the environment if we throw them in the trash. Now, first of all, we don't throw liquids in the solid waste or in the trash. And we want to be really cautious about any solutions that we dump down the drain. A lot of times we'll have local wastewater treatment requirements and rules that are even more stringent than EPA or our state regulators. So we want to be very careful with liquids. But as far as solids are concerned, if we have starches, sugars, plaster of Paris, Epsom salt, pH paper, if we have extras of those types of things, those can go in the trash. In some states, in some conditions, primary neutralization is acceptable but not always. So please, again, we've got to look into guidance on that and see if you are in a state where that's acceptable. Other treatment types, such as evaporation of water from aqueous metal solutions. I've got some schools that will do that if they are in states where that is allowed. It is not always allowed. It depends, again, on your state to state regulations. All right, I'm going to have to start moving a little quicker. I've only got a couple minutes left. Please bear with me. So strategies to minimize waste. One of the things that waste haulers do is they put different waste streams, and your disposal is charged by the container. So you want to make sure that they're grouping as many things together as possible that are compatible. You want to work with your hazardous waste company for that. It's one of the ways to minimize your waste. This is a RCRA hazardous waste cheat sheet. And basically it's going to show you, these are some non-hazardous chemicals that you can use in the lab in your experiments that you don't have to worry about for hazardous waste disposal. But again, I want you to check with wastewater treatment before you dump anything down the drain. And I want you to check with your local hazardous waste regulators to make sure that you're in compliance. Overall, the things that you can do now: work on creating a disposal inventory, ask for assistance either from your state regulators, from Vicki or I, or from one of your hazardous waste disposal vendors. Work with a contractor that knows the state rules that you're in. One of the examples, we've been working with Maine Lab Pack quite a bit, and they're very familiar with the state to state regulations. And I would encourage you that if you are going to do a disposal, that's one vendor that you might be able to reach out to. In New Hampshire, we have a special program. So if you're in New Hampshire and you're interested in working with Maine Lab Pack, reach out to Vicki and she can tell you what the program is that she's put into place with them. If in doubt, please don't dump it down the drain, evaporate it up the hood, or throw it in the trash. If you're questioning whether or not something is hazardous, it probably is. And you'll need to learn what the legal and safe measures for disposal are. The next webinar, we're going to talk about safe storage strategies for science chemicals. I promise you, it's a lot easier to go through than regulations. I'm sorry that we had to hit everything at such high levels. And if you have any questions or you need some guidance, please reach out to us. So for the next webinar that we're teaching next week, we want to talk about how do we store those chemicals that we decide to keep, how do we store them safely? And we're also going to talk about the OSHA hazard communication requirements for labeling. Steps to take today. When you're in working and deciding what to keep and what to get rid of, take a look at the integrity of the shelves that you're working with. Prepare the shelves for ongoing storage. We're going to do some housekeeping discussion next week as well. And then come up with a plan for what your hazardous waste disposal options are and what's going to be the best for your school district. All right. I'm going to go ahead and move this to, here's phone number and website, and also my email address if you need to get a hold of me. And I'll go ahead and turn the camera back on. So I see we have quite a few question and answers. So let me see here. Enclosed glass tubes with mercury and sparkles. Do you need to get rid of them? Because they are pretty cool. Michelle, I totally understand. Mercury itself is it's an amazing element. It's a very cool element. And it's something very unusual. You know, a lot of our students anymore just don't even get to see it. Do you, if you're going to keep it, what I'm going to encourage you to do is put it in at least secondary and tertiary containment. I'm going to recommend that you get rid of most of them. Okay, because what we've run into over the years with a problem is that if we drop one of those mercury containers, that mercury, those beads just go everywhere. And to find them and clean them up to what is an acceptable OSHA exposure level is almost impossible. It is almost impossible. So this is one of those ones where wow, it would be really cool to keep them. You might also want to take some really good photos of them and show students photos. I used to be a big advocate for, well, I'm going to put it in 3 levels of protection and nobody's going to, touch it but me, and I'm going to keep it locked down, and because it's so cool and they need to see it. And anymore, I've seen enough accidents at high schools, and I've also seen enough rough activity with students trying to sneak off with stuff like that, that I just don't think it's worth it any longer. So I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I have to tell you that, but I do think that the risk is higher than the reward on that one. Let's see, the New Hampshire DES has all kinds of information, and Julie has shared a bunch with us. So has Christy Faro, and both of them have been absolutely outstanding in helping make sure that as we're moving through these webinars, that the information that I'm providing to you is as accurate as possible. They've answered a lot of my questions. I have to admit, I am absolutely not an expert in New Hampshire and Vermont, but I can connect you with the experts. So if you've got any questions, reach out and we'll make sure that we get your questions answered. And we'll make sure that you're in compliance with those state regs. We want to absolutely make certain that nobody's doing anything wrong that's going to get them into trouble. So let's see. DES, Julie also pointed out that P and U listed are sole active ingredients. That's a really good distinction to make. Again, I don't really want to take much more time getting into the weeds on this, but U listed and P listed, if you've got a chemical sitting on your shelf, and let's say it's potassium cyanide. Okay, potassium cyanide is number one, super risky, not something you want to have around your school, has no utility in science experiments any longer, never really did. And it is a sole ingredient. It's the only thing that's in that container that's going to have a P listing on it. We have to be very cautious with those P-listed acute toxins. So if it's the pure and unused sole active ingredient and it's on one of those lists, P-list or U-list, then you need to make sure that those codes are on your waste disposal manifesting. The PowerPoint presentation today, yes, it will be available to you as soon as I'm smart enough to figure out how to connect it to my website and the YouTube channel that I'll put it on. So I'm working on it. My web designer got a little behind, but I'm begging and pleading with him to help me get those out in the next week or two. Slide that has the disposable chemicals. I can send that out to you. There are only, one of your, Michelle says one of her mercury things looks a little moldy. That would be really unusual because mercury has actually been used as an antifungal for hundreds of years, but you never know. It's actually probably degrading your corroding and degrading the sparkles that are in it. Mercury is extremely corrosive, just not something that you want to have around. Let's see. Thank you, Christy. I appreciate the input. So New Hampshire does regulate VSQGs, and in New Hampshire, they're called, and I'm going to put this quote out in the chat so you can all see it here. New Hampshire is very unique, okay? And the regulations are a little tough. So most other states, in fact, every other state that I can think of, regulates in 3 categories. So less than 220 pounds a month, 220 to 2,200 pounds, and over 2,200 pounds. In New Hampshire, those are consolidated into 2 different waste categories. The lowest one is under 220 pounds. New Hampshire calls them small quantity generators. In every other state, they're called very small quantity generators. It gets really confusing, guys. So if you have any questions, please reach out. But in New Hampshire, regulations if you generate less than 220 pounds per month, you are considered a small quantity generator, and you have to follow all the rules and regulations for that. So, all right, does anybody else have any other questions? I know we covered a lot of stuff today, and it's complex. Okay, any other questions? Oh,
Hey, very
okay,
nice. Very nice. Thank you.
good deal. Oh, this is a tough one today. This
Yeah.
one's a tough one, you guys. I really struggled with this. There's so much information to cover, and hours just not. When I teach this to industry, for anybody that's still on, when I teach this to industry, this is 2 8-hour days of regulatory learning. And that's only in Iowa where we don't have state regs. So 16 hours of education, and it's just tough.
Is that the HAZWOPER training?
No, that's even different. That's
Oh,
emergency. HAZWOPER is emergency response. That's an
okay.
8-hour, well, 24 or 8 hours. Yeah.
Okay. Wow.
All right. Anybody else? Okay. All right, Daniel, I think we're good to go. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.